The storm sirens had been broken for 3 months in Millfield, Texas, which is why nobody heard the warning that might have saved them precious minutes. Some storms destroy everything in their path. Others reveal what was already broken beneath the surface. When the EF4 tornado tore through the heart of small-town America that spring evening, it didn't just reshape the landscape, it rewrote destinies. In the howling chaos of splintered homes and flying debris, a struggling single father didn't think twice about diving into the wreckage when he heard a faint cry for help. He had nothing to his name except his courage and a stubborn refusal to let anyone die on his watch. What he couldn't know as he shielded this stranger from falling beams was that she held the power to change his life forever. What he couldn't know was that 5 years earlier, her signature on a corporate document had already destroyed everything he held dear. Sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. Sometimes the person you save is the same person who ruined you. And sometimes, in the aftermath of devastation, the most broken things can be rebuilt stronger than before. The tornado was just the beginning. The storm sirens had been broken for 3 months in Millfield, Texas, which is why nobody heard the warning that might have saved them precious minutes. Bob Mitchell was elbow deep in the engine of a 2018 Ford pickup when the sky turned that sickly green color that every Texan learns to fear. The air pressure dropped so suddenly his ears popped, and the wrench slipped from his suddenly sweaty palm. "Emma," he called toward the small office attached to his garage. "You hearing this wind?" His 16-year-old daughter looked up from her physics homework. Pencil paused mid-equation. Through the grimy windows of Mitchell's auto repair, they could see debris beginning to dance in the air like some macabre ballet. Tree branches, loose shingles, and what looked like someone's patio furniture tumbled past in the increasingly violent wind. "Dad!" Emma's voice carried that particular tone she'd inherited from her mother, calm in crisis, steady as bedrock. "That's not just wind." Bob wiped his hands on his coveralls. Oil-stained fabric that had seen better years, much like everything else in his life since Margaret's death. The medical bills had taken the house, the savings, and very nearly his sanity. The garage was all he had left. This little slice of independence where he could fix things with his hands instead of watching everything fall apart around him. The roar hit them like a freight train made of pure sound. Through the windows, they watched the sky birth a monster, a massive funnel cloud dropping from the storm cells, its rotation hypnotic and terrifying. An EF4 Bob's engineer brain calculated automatically, maybe stronger, the kind that turned towns into debris fields and sent families searching through rubble for pieces of their lives. "Storm cellar," he said, but Emma was already moving toward the reinforced door he'd installed in the garage floor 3 years ago. One of the few smart investments he'd made since losing everything. The cellar was small, cramped, but it would hold. That's when they heard it. Through the howling wind and the approaching freight train roar of the tornado, a sound that stopped Bob's heart, the screech of tearing metal, followed by a woman's scream. Bob looked toward the road, where a sleek black Mercedes had been traveling just moments before. Now it lay on its side, 40 feet from the asphalt, steam rising from its crumpled hood. The tornado was less than a quarter-mile away and closing fast, its base nearly a half-mile wide and growing. "Dad, no," Emma said, reading his expression. "You can't." But Bob was already running, his construction boots pounding against the garage floor. 4 years ago, he'd watched his wife slip away one breath at a time, helpless to save her. He couldn't watch another person die while he stood by and did nothing. The wind hit him like a physical blow as he burst from the garage. Debris pelted his shoulders and back gravel, small branches, pieces of someone's roof. The Mercedes lay crumpled against an oak tree that had probably been growing since before Texas was a state. Through the spider-webbed rear window, he could see movement. "Hold on," he shouted, though his voice was instantly swallowed by the storm's roar. The car's frame had buckled, pinning the driver's door shut. Bob scrambled around to the passenger side, where the impact had popped the door partially open. Inside, a woman in an expensive business suit was trapped. Her left arm caught beneath the twisted dashboard, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. She was conscious, her dark eyes wide with shock and pain, but very much alive. And she was looking at him like he was either an angel or a madman for being out in this storm. "Can you move?" Bob shouted, pulling on the passenger door. The frame was bent, but his years of construction work before the garage had given him the kind of functional strength that could bend reality when it had to. "My arm," she gasped, trying to gesture with her free hand. "I can't." The tornado's roar grew deafening. Bob could feel the pressure change pulling at his clothes, trying to lift him off his feet. Trees were snapping like toothpicks in the distance, and he could see the dark funnel clearly now, maybe 200 yards away and eating up ground fast. "I'm going to pull you out," he said, reaching across her to examine how her arm was trapped. The dashboard had folded down, pinning her wrist, but it looked more like pressure than actual crushing damage. "This is going to hurt." She nodded, clenching her jaw in preparation. Bob braced himself against the car frame and pulled, using leverage instead of brute force. The dashboard shifted just enough, and the woman cried out as her arm came free. Bob could see it was badly bruised but not obviously broken. "Can you run?" he asked. "I think so." Bob helped her from the car, immediately wrapping his arm around her waist as the wind tried to knock them both down. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 5'6" in her expensive heels, but she moved with purpose despite her obvious pain. They half ran, half stumbled toward the garage, fighting wind that seemed determined to peel them away from the earth. Bob could hear Emma screaming his name from somewhere ahead, though he couldn't see her through the flying debris. A piece of metal roofing sailed past his head, missing him by inches. The garage loomed ahead like salvation. Emma stood in the doorway of the storm cellar, her face pale with terror, but her voice strong as she guided them in. "Here this way." Bob practically threw the injured woman down the concrete steps, then dove after her as the tornado's outer circulation reached the garage. The building groaned and shuddered above them as Bob slammed the storm cellar door and threw the heavy bolt. The space was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a ceiling reinforced with steel beams. Emergency lanterns cast everything in harsh white light. Emma had already pulled out the first aid kit, her movements efficient despite the terror Bob could see in her eyes. "You're okay," Bob said to the woman, as much to convince himself as her. "We're okay. The tornado will pass." The woman nodded, trying to catch her breath. Up close, Bob could see she was probably in her late 40s, with the kind of bearing that spoke of boardrooms and private jets. Her suit was torn and dirty now, but it had probably cost more than Bob made in 2 months. Her jewelry was understated but clearly expensive, the kind of wealth that didn't need to advertise itself. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "I thought when I saw that storm." The building above them screamed. Metal tore away from wood with the sound of 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard. Something massive crashed into the garage, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The woman flinched, and Bob found himself moving closer, offering what comfort he could to a stranger he just pulled from the wreckage. "I'm Bob Mitchell," he said, trying to project calm. "This is my daughter Emma." "Victoria," the woman replied, then hesitated slightly. "Victoria Sterling." Emma looked up from where she was arranging medical supplies, her eyes widening. Bob felt something cold settle in his stomach. Victoria Sterling. He knew that name, though he'd never seen her face in the society pages or business magazines. Victoria Sterling, whose family company had bought out half of Texas over the past decade. Victoria Sterling, the mysterious billionaire who'd inherited one of the largest private fortunes in America and then essentially vanished from public view. Victoria Sterling, whose company had destroyed his life. Above them, the tornado completed its work. The roar faded to a rumble, then to the sound of wind and settling debris. In the sudden relative quiet, Bob could hear his own heartbeat, fast and hard. He looked at the woman Victoria sitting on the storage bench, holding her injured arm and trying to stop the bleeding from her forehead cut. She had no idea who he was. No idea that 5 years ago, Sterling Industries had acquired the aerospace company where Bob had worked as a senior engineer, developing satellite guidance systems for NASA. No idea that when Margaret's cancer had required months of treatment, leaving Bob to balance a demanding career with caring for his dying wife. Sterling's efficiency experts had marked him as non-essential personnel and eliminated his position. No idea that her company's decision had cost him his career, his house, his savings, and very nearly his sanity. "Are you hurt badly?" Emma asked Victoria, moving closer with the first aid kit. Bob's daughter had her mother's gift for putting people at ease, a natural empathy that made everyone feel cared for. "I don't think so," Victoria replied, managing a weak smile. "Bruised ribs, maybe a sprained wrist. Nothing that won't heal." She looked at Bob. "Thanks to your father, I owe him my life." Bob said nothing, his mind racing. Above them, the garage was probably destroyed. His business, his livelihood. The only thing standing between him and complete financial ruin gone. And here sat the woman whose corporate empire had already taken everything else from him. But as he watched Emma gently clean the cut on Victoria's forehead, as he saw the gratitude and vulnerability in this powerful woman's eyes, Bob felt the anger that had sustained him for 5 years begin to crack. She wasn't the cold corporate titan he'd imagined. She was just a person, hurt and scared and grateful to be alive. "The storm's passed," Bob said finally. "Let's see what's left up there." When they emerged from the storm cellar 20 minutes later, Millfield looked like a war zone. Bob's garage was gone, not damaged, but completely gone, as if it had been erased from the earth. The oak tree that had stopped Victoria's car was now a splintered stump. Down Main Street, he could see that the tornado had cut a path of destruction nearly a quarter-mile wide through the heart of town. Victoria stood beside him, surveying the devastation with the same stunned expression he was sure he wore. Emma moved between them, her young mind already processing, planning, figuring out what came next. She'd grown up too fast since her mother's death, forced into a maturity that no 16-year-old should need. "Our house," Emma said quietly, pointing toward where their small rental should have been visible through the trees. There was nothing there but empty space and scattered debris. Bob felt something break inside his chest. The garage, the house, his truck, everything. The tornado had taken what little Sterling Industries had left him. He closed his eyes, trying to calculate how they would survive this. His savings account had maybe $300. Emma's college fund had been emptied 2 years ago to pay for Margaret's final round of treatments. They had nothing. "Bob," Victoria's voice was soft, tentative. "Your business. Your home, I'm so sorry." Irani, he opened his eyes to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Concern, certainly, but something else. Guilt, did she somehow know insurance will cover some of it? He lied, because what else could he say that he'd let the business coverage lapse to afford Emma's school supplies, that the house insurance was basic at best, and wouldn't come close to replacing what they'd lost? "Dad," Emma said, her voice carefully controlled. "What about—" She stopped herself, but Bob knew what she was thinking. "What about MIT? The acceptance letter had come 2 weeks ago, along with the financial aid package that would cover tuition, but left them responsible for room, board, and living expenses. Money they didn't have even before the tornado." "We'll figure it out," Bob said, though he had no idea how. Victoria was looking between them, clearly understanding more than she was saying. "Is there somewhere you can stay family?" Bob shook his head. Margaret's sister lived in California, but they'd never been close. His own family was scattered, and none of them had resources to help. "The Red Cross will set up shelters," he said. "We'll manage." But Victoria wasn't listening. She was staring at something in the debris field, her face pale. Following her gaze, Bob saw a piece of metal that looked like it had come from her Mercedes license plate, bent but readable. Below it, scattered papers fluttered in the wind like dying birds. "My briefcase," she said, starting toward the debris. "I need—" Bob caught her arm gently. It's not safe. There could be downed power lines, gas leaks. We should wait for emergency crews. She looked at him, and for a moment he saw past the corporate composure to something that might have been fear. You don't understand. Those papers, they're important. More important than your life, Bob asked, because that's what you're risking going out there. Victoria stared at the scattered documents, her jaw working as if she was fighting some internal battle. Finally, she nodded. You're right. Of course. You're right. In the distance, they could hear sirens, emergency vehicles navigating the debris-choked streets, trying to reach people who might be trapped or injured. Bob thought about his neighbors, about Mrs. Henderson, who lived alone with her 3 cats, about the Ramirez family with their newborn baby. How many people were hurt? How many had lost everything, like him? We should help, Emma said, echoing his thoughts. There might be people trapped. Bob nodded, proud of his daughter's instinct to think of others, even in their own crisis. Victoria, you should get that head wound looked at by a paramedic. Emma and I'm coming with you. Victoria interrupted. I want to help. Bob started to protest she was injured. She wasn't dressed for disaster relief. She was Victoria Sterling. For God's sake, but something in her expression stopped him. Determination, maybe, or need. The need to do something useful, something that mattered, something that wasn't about corporate profits or quarterly reports. All right, he said, but we stay together, and we're careful. They spent the next 6 hours moving through the devastation, calling out for survivors, helping clear debris from trapped vehicles, directing emergency crews to people who needed medical attention. Victoria worked alongside them without complaint, her expensive suit getting progressively dirtier as she lifted boards and called out encouragement to frightened children. Bob watched her throughout the day, his mental image of the cold corporate executive steadily crumbling. This woman knelt in the mud to comfort an elderly man whose house had been destroyed. She gave her bottled water to a crying toddler whose parents were frantically searching for their cat. She used her cell phone to help coordinate rescue efforts, calling in resources with an efficiency that spoke of someone accustomed to making things happen. By evening, they were exhausted. The immediate search and rescue was winding down, replaced by the longer-term work of assessing damage and beginning recovery. Bob sat on the steps of what had been Millfield's post office, watching emergency crews work by floodlight. Emma dozed against his shoulder, worn out by the emotional and physical demands of the day. Victoria approached, moving carefully. Her injured arm was in a makeshift sling now, and the cut on her forehead had been properly bandaged by a paramedic. She looked as tired as Bob felt. They're setting up an emergency shelter at the high school, she said. Red Cross is bringing in cots and food. Bob nodded. The high school was one of the few large buildings that had escaped major damage. It would house dozens of families tonight, maybe for weeks while people figured out what came next. What about you? Bob asked. Your people must be looking for you by now. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. I told my assistant I was taking a few days off, driving to Houston for meetings. No one knows where I am. There was something in her voice, a note that Bob couldn't quite identify. Relief, fear. He studied her profile in the harsh emergency lighting. They'll worry. Maybe. She turned to look at him. Bob, what you did today pulling me from that car, helping everyone here. Why? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? You risked your life for a complete stranger. Then you spent the day helping other strangers, even though you'd lost everything yourself. Why? Bob thought about it, trying to put into words something he'd never really examined. Because that's what you do, he said finally. When people need help, you help. When things are broken, you try to fix them. Victoria nodded slowly, as if his answer explained something she'd been trying to understand. At the shelter tonight, would you mind if I stayed with you and Emma? I know it sounds strange, but I don't really have anywhere else to go. Bob looked at her, this billionaire asking to sleep on a Red Cross cot in a high school gymnasium, and realized she meant it. For whatever reason, Victoria Sterling, one of the wealthiest women in America, genuinely had nowhere else to go. "Of course," he said, "we'd be glad to have you." What he didn't say was that having her there made him feel less alone, less overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were facing. Margaret used to say that shared troubles were half as heavy, and shared joys were twice as bright. Tonight, with everything they owned scattered across 3 counties by a tornado's fury, Bob found unexpected comfort in the presence of a stranger who had become something more. A stranger who, he was beginning to suspect, was running from something just as devastating as any natural disaster. The Millfield High School gymnasium smelled of industrial disinfectant and too many people in too small a space. Red Cross volunteers had arranged cots in neat rows, creating the illusion of privacy with carefully hung blankets and respectful distances. The sounds were what got to you: dozens of whispered conversations, crying babies, the rustle of emergency blankets, and underneath it all, the weight of collective grief and uncertainty. Bob lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. To his left, Emma slept the deep sleep of exhaustion, one arm flung over her eyes to block out the emergency lighting that never quite went dark. To his right, Victoria lay curled on her side, her injured arm tucked carefully against her body. She wasn't sleeping either. "Bob," her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you awake?" "Yeah. I've never been in a place like this. A shelter. I mean," Bob turned his head to look at her. In the dim light, with her hair disheveled and her expensive suit replaced by donated Red Cross clothing, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Most people haven't. It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Victoria was quiet for so long that Bob thought she might have fallen asleep. Then, despair, I guess, hopelessness. "But that's not what I see here." Bob followed her gaze across the gymnasium. She was right. Despite losing everything, people were helping each other. Mrs. Henderson was teaching a group of restless children card games. The Ramirez family was sharing their dinner with an elderly couple who had no family in town. Teenagers were helping younger kids with homework by flashlight. "That's Millfield," Bob said softly. "We take care of each other." "Is that why you stayed after?" She stopped herself. "After what?" Another long pause. "Nothing. I'm sorry. I'm just tired." But Bob had heard something in her voice, a note that suggested she knew more than she was saying. He propped himself up on one elbow, studying her face in the dim light. "Victoria, do we know each other, I mean, from before today?" She met his eyes and he saw her internal struggle play out across her features. Fear, guilt, and something that might have been longing. "No," she said finally. "We've never met." Bob knew she was lying, but he couldn't push. Not here. Not when she was injured and exhausted and as displaced as he was. But something was going on. Some connection he was missing. "Tell me about Emma," Victoria said, clearly changing the subject. "She's remarkable. That composure during the storm, the way she helped people today, she gets that from you." "From her mother, mostly." Bob's voice softened the way it always did when he talked about Margaret. "Margaret was a nurse. She had this way of making people feel safe, even when everything was falling apart. What happened to her? Cancer, ovarian. By the time they caught it, it had spread too far." The familiar ache settled in his chest. "We fought it for 2 years, but in the end..." "I'm sorry. The medical bills took everything. The house, my retirement savings, Emma's college fund. I had a good job before, working for an aerospace company, but when Margaret got sick, I needed time off, flexible schedules. The company wasn't interested in accommodating that." The bitterness crept into his voice despite his efforts to keep it out. "They eliminated my position during a reorganization, said it was about efficiency, but I know better." Victoria went very still beside him. "What company?" "Horizon Aerospace. They were bought out by a bigger corporation right around the time Margaret got diagnosed. The new owners brought in consultants, streamlined operations, I was just collateral damage. Bob heard her breath catch. So softly he almost missed it. When he looked at her face was pale in the emergency lighting. What was the bigger corporation? She asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. Sterling Industries. Bob couldn't keep the anger out of his voice now. Owned by some reclusive billionaire who probably never gave a thought to the lives she was destroying? People like that, they see employees as numbers on a spreadsheet, not human beings with families and mortgages and sick wives. Victoria closed her eyes, and Bob saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. Victoria, are you all right? She opened her eyes, and they were bright with unshed tears. Bob, I need to tell you something. Before she could continue, Emma stirred on her cot, murmuring something in her sleep. Both adults froze, waiting, but she settled back into deep slumber. What is it? Bob whispered. Victoria stared at the ceiling for a long moment, then turned to face him fully. My full name is Victoria Sterling. I own Sterling Industries. The words hit Bob like a physical blow. He sat up abruptly, then forced himself to lower his voice when several nearby families stirred in their sleep. You're the reclusive billionaire who destroyed your life. Yes. Her voice was barely audible, thick with what sounded like shame. Bob, I need you to know that I had no idea about your specific case. I mean, I knew we were acquiring companies, streamlining operations, but I never looked at the individual. Get away from us. Bob's voice was cold, controlled, but Victoria flinched as if he'd shouted, Bob, please. I said get away. He stood up, his movements sharp with barely contained fury. Find somewhere else to sleep. Somewhere else to be? Victoria sat up, her injured arm clearly causing her pain. I understand you're angry. Angry, Bob laughed, but there was no humor in it. My wife died because your company's health insurance ended when you fired me. Emma had to watch her mother waste away while I worked 3 part-time jobs trying to pay for treatment. We lost our house, our future, everything. Other people in the shelter were starting to notice the disturbance. Bob forced himself to lower his voice, but the words came out like chips of ice. I pulled you out of that wreckage today. I saved your life, and you're the person who destroyed mine. Victoria stood as well, swaying slightly. You're right. You're absolutely right to hate me. But Bob, please let me explain. There's nothing to explain. Bob turned away from her. Stay away from me and my daughter. He lay back down on his cot, turning his back to her. After several minutes, he heard her gathering her few belongings and moving to an empty cot on the far side of the gymnasium. Bob stared at the wall, his mind reeling. Victoria Sterling. He'd spent 5 years hating a faceless corporate entity, and it turned out to have the face of a woman who cried over injured strangers and gave her water to thirsty children. A woman who'd worked alongside him all day, helping people who had lost everything. A woman who, he was beginning to realize, might be running from her own losses. But none of that changed what her company had done to his family. None of that brought Margaret back or restored the years of financial security they'd lost. Victoria Sterling might be more human than he'd imagined, but she was still the architect of his suffering. Across the gymnasium, he could see her silhouette on the distant cot, sitting upright, not even trying to sleep. For a moment, Bob felt something that might have been sympathy. Then he remembered Margaret's final hospital bills, remembered telling Emma they couldn't afford the robotics camp she'd dreamed of attending, remembered the night he'd sat in his truck outside the bank, trying to figure out how to tell his daughter they were losing their home. The sympathy hardened back into anger. Victoria Sterling could sleep wherever she wanted, but she was no longer welcome near his family. Morning came too early and too bright, streaming through the gymnasium's high windows and illuminating the organized chaos of the emergency shelter. Bob woke to the sound of volunteers distributing coffee and donuts, their cheerful voices a jarring contrast to the subdued conversations of displaced families planning their uncertain futures. Emma was already awake, sitting cross-legged on her cot and staring across the gymnasium. Bob followed her gaze and saw Victoria's empty cot, sheets folded with military precision. She left early, Emma said quietly. Around 5 a.m. I heard her talking on her phone. Bob felt an unexpected stab of something, not guilt, exactly, but unease. He'd been harsh last night, though she'd deserved it. Hadn't she, Dad? Emma's voice carried that particular tone that meant she was about to say something he probably didn't want to hear. I know who she is. Bob sat up, running his hands through his hair. Emma. Victoria Sterling. I recognized the name when she introduced herself, but I thought it was a coincidence. Then I heard what you two were talking about last night. You were supposed to be asleep. Emma gave him a look that was pure Margaret, patient but implacable. Dad, I'm not 10. I know what Sterling Industries did to us. I know why you had to give up engineering and open the garage. I know why we moved to the rental house and why you work 7 days a week. Bob studied his daughter's face, seeing again how much older she'd grown than her 16 years. So you understand why. I understand why you're angry, Emma interrupted. But Dad, she saved my life yesterday. What are you talking about? Emma pointed toward the far corner of the gymnasium, where a section of the ceiling had partially collapsed during the night. Emergency crews were cleaning up debris, including chunks of concrete that would have been directly over Emma's cot. Around 4 a.m., part of the roof started groaning. Victoria heard it first and woke everyone up in that section. She made sure we all moved before it came down. Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but Bob could see the fear in her eyes. If she hadn't been awake, hadn't been listening. Bob stared at the debris field, his mind racing. A piece of concrete the size of a bowling ball lay exactly where Emma's head had been just hours ago. Where did she go? He asked. I don't know. She just gathered her things and left. But Dad, Emma hesitated. I think she was crying. Before Bob could respond, a commotion near the gymnasium entrance drew their attention. A convoy of black SUVs had pulled up outside, and people in expensive suits were climbing out. Even from a distance, Bob could see their urgency, their barely controlled panic. Mr. Mitchell. A Red Cross volunteer approached their cots. There are some people here asking about you and your daughter. They say it's urgent. Bob and Emma exchanged glances. What kind of people? Corporate types. They mentioned something about Ms. Sterling. Bob's jaw tightened. So Victoria had sent her people to clean up the mess, to manage the situation like any other corporate crisis, probably with lawyers and non-disclosure agreements and enough money to make the inconvenient truth disappear. Tell them we're not interested, Bob said, but it was too late. A man in an expensive suit was already striding across the gymnasium, flanked by 2 security personnel. He moved with the kind of purposeful arrogance that Bob associated with corporate executives, the ones who'd sat across from him 5 years ago, and explained that his position was being eliminated for the good of the company. Mr. Mitchell, I'm Harrison Webb, Ms. Sterling's assistant. I need to speak with you about a matter of urgent importance. There's nothing to discuss, Bob said, standing up. Whatever Ms. Sterling is offering, we're not interested. Harrison looked confused. I'm sorry, sir, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not here about an offer. I'm here because Ms. Sterling is missing. Emma stood up beside Bob. Missing. She left the shelter early this morning and hasn't returned to her hotel. Her phone is going straight to voicemail, and her security detail lost track of her vehicle. Harrison's professional composure cracked slightly. Mr. Mitchell, you were the last person to have an extended conversation with her. Did she say anything about where she might go? Bob felt the anger drain out of him, replaced by concern he didn't want to acknowledge. How long has she been gone? 6 hours? In normal circumstances, that wouldn't be cause for alarm. But Ms. Sterling hasn't been herself lately. Her behavior has been increasingly erratic, and after yesterday's trauma, Harrison trailed off. But Bob could fill in the blanks. Victoria was running from something, and yesterday's tornado had pushed her over some kind of edge. What kind of erratic behavior? Emma asked. Harrison hesitated, clearly debating how much to reveal. Ms. Sterling has been talking about making major changes to Sterling Industries. Radical restructuring that would essentially give away billions of dollars in assets. The board is concerned about her mental state, especially after her husband's death 5 years ago. Bob's mind raced. Victoria's husband had died 5 years ago, right around the same time Margaret had gotten sick. Right around the time Sterling Industries had acquired Horizon Aerospace. While Bob had been watching his wife waste away from cancer, Victoria had been dealing with her own devastating loss. She didn't say where she was going, Bob said finally, but she was upset when she left. Upset about what? Bob glanced at Emma, who gave him an encouraging nod. She told me who she was, about Sterling Industries. We didn't part on good terms. Harrison's expression grew even more concerned. What exactly did you discuss? For a moment, Bob considered lying, giving some sanitized version that wouldn't reveal the depth of his anger or Victoria's obvious guilt. But Emma was watching him with Margaret's eyes, and he could almost hear his wife's voice. Tell the truth. Bob, the truth is always better than the alternative. I told her that her company destroyed my family, Bob said quietly. That my wife died because Sterling Industries fired me and ended our health insurance. That she was responsible for 5 years of struggle and loss. Harrison went pale. Oh God, Mr. Mitchell, you have to understand, Ms. Sterling didn't know. She's been trying to track down the families affected by the acquisitions from that period. She's been working with lawyers and accountants to make restitution. What are you talking about? The radical restructuring I mentioned. Ms. Sterling has been liquidating non-essential assets to create a fund for families impacted by Sterling Industries' expansion in the early 2020s. She's identified nearly 200 families who lost jobs or benefits during that period. Harrison's voice grew urgent. Mr. Mitchell, your family is at the top of that list. Bob felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. She's been looking for us. For months. The plan was to reach out through lawyers, make discreet contact. But when she saw your name and address in the tornado aftermath reports, Harrison shook his head. She insisted on coming to Millfield personally, said she needed to see the community before making any decisions about the fund. Emma grabbed Bob's arm. Dad, that's why she was here. She wasn't just driving through, she came here specifically to find us. Bob thought about Victoria's behavior over the past day, the way she'd insisted on helping with disaster relief, the questions about his work history, the tears in her eyes when he told her about Sterling Industries. She hadn't been playing a role or managing a crisis. She'd been confronting the consequences of her company's actions firsthand. Where would she go, Bob asked, if she was upset, if she wanted to be alone? I don't know, Harrison admitted. Ms. Sterling is intensely private. She doesn't have close friends, doesn't confide in anyone except. He looked at Bob with dawning realization. Except apparently she confided in you yesterday. Bob closed his eyes, thinking about their conversations in the storm shelter and later in the gymnasium. Victoria had seemed drawn to their small family, fascinated by their closeness and resilience. She'd talked about never being in a place like the shelter, about not understanding why people weren't more despairing. A memory surfaced Victoria, staring at the scattered papers from her briefcase, insisting she needed to retrieve them despite the danger. Important documents that she'd ultimately left behind. The briefcase, Bob said suddenly. She was desperate to get papers from her car wreckage yesterday. What was in it? Harrison looked uncomfortable. Legal documents related to the restitution fund, contracts, financial projections, lists of affected families. He paused. And her husband's suicide note. The words hit Bob like a physical blow. Suicide. David Sterling killed himself after a series of business failures that cost Sterling Industries billions. The guilt, the pressure, it broke him. Miss Sterling has carried that briefcase with her everywhere for 5 years. She says it reminds her of the cost of corporate decisions. Bob felt something crack inside his chest. Not anger this time, but a different kind of pain. Understanding. Victoria hadn't just been dealing with grief. She'd been carrying the weight of responsibility for her husband's death, for every life her company had damaged. She might go back, Emma said quietly, to where the car crashed, to look for her briefcase. Bob was already moving, grabbing his jacket and heading for the gymnasium exit. Harrison, I need a car. Mr. Mitchell, what are you? I'm going to find her, Bob said, before she does something irreversible. Because he understood now what Victoria was running from. Not just the corporate responsibility or the board's pressure, but the same crushing guilt that had nearly destroyed him after Margaret's death. The weight of feeling responsible for every bad outcome, every moment of suffering, every life that had been forever changed by forces beyond anyone's complete control. Victoria Sterling wasn't the cold corporate villain he'd imagined. She was a woman drowning in grief and guilt, trying to find some way to make amends for damage that could never truly be undone. And Bob Mitchell, who knew something about drowning in guilt, was going to pull her back from whatever edge she was approaching. Just as she had pulled his daughter back from the collapsing ceiling in the middle of the night. The wreckage of Victoria's Mercedes looked even worse in daylight. The sleek luxury sedan had been twisted into abstract art by the tornado's violence. Its black paint scored and dented, windows blown out, the frame bent at angles that defied engineering. Bob approached carefully, watching for sharp metal and unstable debris. Victoria sat in the passenger seat, or what remained of it. She climbed through the destroyed windshield and now sat among the wreckage. Papers scattered around her like fallen snow. Her borrowed Red Cross clothing was torn from navigating the twisted metal, and she held something in her hands that caught the morning sunlight. Victoria, Bob called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and he saw that what she held was a photograph. Even from several feet away, he could see it was a wedding picture, a younger Victoria in white, standing beside a handsome man with kind eyes and an uncertain smile. I found the briefcase, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Most of the papers are ruined, but David's note survived. She held up a piece of cream-colored stationery, elegant handwriting visible despite water damage. Amazing how the most painful things always survive, isn't it? Bob moved closer, stepping carefully over debris. Harrison told me about your husband. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Did he tell you that David killed himself because of business decisions I signed off? On that he invested our personal fortune in a series of ventures that failed because I was too busy with Sterling Industries to pay attention. She looked at the photograph again. Did he tell you that my husband put a gun to his head because he couldn't live with the guilt of losing money that belonged to pension funds and college savings accounts? Victoria. I've spent 5 years trying to figure out how to make it right, she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. How to undo the damage we caused. David thought the answer was death, but I thought maybe it was money. Give back what we took, help the families we hurt, rebuild what we destroyed. She gestured to the scattered papers around her. 237 families identified as directly impacted by Sterling Industries acquisitions between 2019 and 2024. Compensation calculated based on lost wages, medical costs, educational opportunities, $743 million allocated for restitution. Bob felt the number hit him like a physical force. $700 million. It seemed like a lot until yesterday. Victoria carefully placed the photograph in her lap. Until I met a man who risked his life to save a stranger, who spent his day helping people he'd never met, who raised a daughter so remarkable that she makes me believe in the possibility of goodness again. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. You could have let me die in this car. Bob, you had every reason to. Sterling Industries destroyed your life. And I signed the paperwork. I approved the acquisition that cost you your job, your wife's health care, your family's future. Victoria, you didn't know ignorance isn't innocence, she said firmly. I chose not to know. I chose to trust other people to handle the details while I focused on the big picture, the quarterly reports, the stock prices. I chose to build walls so high that I couldn't see the lives being destroyed in my company's shadow. Bob sat down on a piece of debris, studying her face. The corporate composure was completely gone now, replaced by raw vulnerability and pain. So what happens now? You disappear. Let guilt eat you alive the way it did your husband. Victoria flinched as if he'd slapped her. Maybe that would be justice. Justice for who? Bob's voice grew sharp. For the families you're trying to help. For the $700 million that would just sit in some corporate account instead of changing lives. For Emma, who was planning to give up her MIT dreams because we can't afford college. Victoria looked at him in surprise. Met him. Full academic scholarship, Bob said, pride creeping into his voice despite everything. But we can't cover room and board, living expenses. She was going to stay in Texas, go to a local school, take out massive loans. He paused. Yesterday, before the tornado, she told me not to worry about it, that she'd figure out a way. Do you know what that means? It means my 16-year-old daughter was planning to sacrifice her dreams to protect me from more financial stress. Bob, so don't talk to me about justice. Victoria, justice isn't you sitting in a wrecked car feeling sorry for yourself. Justice is making sure Emma gets to MIT. Justice is helping families rebuild their lives. Justice is you getting up, going back to your company, and making sure this never happens again. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. You're not what I expected. Neither are you. She carefully gathered the scattered papers, most too damaged to read, but precious nonetheless. The board wants to have me declared mentally incompetent. They think the restitution fund is a sign of instability, that I'm making irrational decisions based on grief. Are you? Victoria considered the question seriously. Probably. But I've been making rational decisions for 5 years, and they led me to sitting alone in a mansion, eating dinner for one every night, surrounded by wealth that feels more like a prison than a blessing. She looked at the wedding photograph again. Maybe a little irrationality is what I need. Or maybe you need help, Bob said quietly. People who understand what you're trying to do. People who can make sure the money actually reaches the families who need it, instead of getting lost in corporate bureaucracy. What are you suggesting? Bob thought about Emma's face when she'd opened the MIT acceptance letter, about his years of engineering experience, gathering dust while he changed oil and rotated tires, about Victoria's obvious isolation and desperate need for genuine human connection. Partnership, he said finally. You have resources and good intentions. I have real-world experience with what families like mine actually need. Emma has the kind of brilliant, innovative mind that could help design programs that actually work. Victoria stared at him. You want to work with me after what my company did to your family. I want to work with you because of what your company did, Bob corrected. You can't undo the past, Victoria, but you can build a better future. We both can. He stood up, offering her his hand. But not if you're sitting in a wrecked car, drowning in guilt. David couldn't live with what happened. But you can make it mean something. Victoria looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. The board will fight us. They'll say I'm being manipulated by someone with a financial interest in the fund. Let them try. Bob's smile was sharp. They'll be fighting a man who knows exactly how corporate cost-cutting works, and a teenage genius who wants to revolutionize sustainable technology. Plus a billionaire who's finally figured out what her money is actually for. Victoria took his hand, letting him help her up from the wreckage. This is insane. The best things usually are. As they walked away from the destroyed Mercedes, Victoria clutching her husband's photograph and the surviving documents, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years' hope. Not just for Emma's education or their financial future, but for the possibility that tragedy could be transformed into purpose. Behind them, the tornado's path of destruction stretched across Millfield like a scar. But ahead, the town was already beginning to rebuild, neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming friends, communities discovering their own resilience. Sometimes the storm was just the beginning of the story. The Sterling Industries boardroom had never seen anything quite like this. Around the polished mahogany table sat some of the most powerful executives and lawyers in Texas, their expensive suits and careful composure forming a stark contrast to the three people facing them from the other side. Victoria sat at the head of the table in her position as CEO, but she was flanked by Bob Mitchell in his only good shirt and tie, and Emma Mitchell in her best dress clothing they'd bought that morning with the emergency funds Victoria had quietly arranged. The teenagers sat with perfect posture, a laptop open in front of her, looking every bit as professional as the adults around her, despite being 30 years younger than anyone else in the room. "This is highly irregular," said board member Charles Hartman, his voice carrying the particular disdain that wealthy men reserved for situations they couldn't control. "Ms. Sterling, bringing outsiders into a board meeting. Mr. Mitchell and his daughter are not outsiders," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "They are consultants hired to advise Sterling Industries on our community development initiatives. Their expertise in real-world impacts of corporate restructuring is precisely what this board has been lacking." Bob watched the subtle power play with fascination. This was Victoria in her element, corporate predator, disguised as gracious host, steel wrapped in silk. She'd spent the past 3 days coaching him and Emma on board dynamics, teaching them to read the political currents and hidden agendas that govern rooms like this. "The proposed restitution fund," continued board member Margaret Volkov, "represents an untenable financial commitment. $743 million in direct payments, plus the administrative costs, will improve our public image and reduce potential legal liability," Emma said calmly, her young voice cutting through the corporate speak like a knife. "I've run the numbers. Sterling Industries spends more than that amount every 2 years on legal fees defending against wrongful termination suits and regulatory violations." The board members stared at the teenager, who had just schooled them on their own company's finances. Emma continued, clicking through a presentation she'd prepared. "Moreover, the economic multiplier effect of direct payments to struggling families exceeds 1.7 times the initial investment. Every dollar we give to families like mine gets spent immediately on necessities housing, healthcare, education, which generates additional economic activity in the communities where Sterling Industries operates." Bob felt a surge of pride watching his daughter command the room. 3 days ago, she'd been doing homework in a tornado shelter. Now she was presenting economic analysis to billionaires and holding her own. "The fund isn't charity," Victoria added. "It's investment. Investment in the communities where we want to expand, in the goodwill that makes local partnerships possible, in the kind of sustainable growth that builds long-term value." Board member James Richardson leaned forward. "And what role would Mr. Mitchell play in this initiative?" Bob cleared his throat, fighting the nervousness that always hit him in rooms full of people whose monthly salaries exceeded his annual income. "Oversight and implementation, making sure the money actually reaches the families who need it, in forms they can use." He opened his own folder, pulling out photographs and documents he'd prepared. "Most corporate assistance programs fail because they're designed by people who've never been poor. You offer job training for positions that don't exist. You provide vouchers for services that aren't available in rural areas. You create application processes so complex that the people who most need help can't navigate them." Bob laid out a photo of their destroyed garage. "When the tornado hit, we needed shelter, food, and medical care. The Red Cross provided all three within hours. They didn't ask for credit checks or employment verification. They didn't require us to attend mandatory seminars on financial responsibility. They just helped." "The Mitchell model," Emma added, advancing to the next slide in her presentation, "is direct assistance with minimal bureaucracy, cash payments sized to each family's specific situation, delivered with dignity and respect." Victoria watched the board members' faces, reading their objections before they could voice them. "I know what you're thinking, that direct cash payments are risky, that families might misuse the money, that we can't control outcomes." She stood up, moving to the window that overlooked downtown Houston's gleaming business district. 5 years ago, I thought the same way. I believe that corporate efficiency and market discipline were the best ways to help people. That if we just created enough wealth at the top, it would eventually benefit everyone. Victoria turned back to the room. Then my husband killed himself because he couldn't live with the consequences of decisions we'd made in boardrooms just like this one. Decisions that seemed rational and necessary and profitable, right up until they destroyed lives. The room was silent. Board members shifted uncomfortably, unused to such personal revelations in corporate settings. The Mitchell family lost everything because of our efficiency, Victoria continued. Bob Mitchell went from being a senior aerospace engineer to changing oil in a small-town garage. His daughter was planning to give up MIT because they couldn't afford college. And until 3 days ago, I had no idea they existed. She returned to her seat, her voice growing stronger. That's the real problem, isn't it? We make decisions that affect thousands of lives, and we never see the faces behind the numbers. We never meet the families whose futures we're reshaping with our quarterly projections and cost-cutting measures. Emma spoke up again. The restitution fund isn't just about money. It's about Sterling Industries acknowledging that corporate decisions have human consequences. It's about building relationships with communities instead of just extracting resources from them. Bob nodded. And it's about making sure that the next time Sterling Industries acquires a company or closes a facility, someone in this room asked the question, what happens to the families? Board member Hartman frowned. Mr. Mitchell, with all due respect, sentiment doesn't drive shareholder value. Neither does constant litigation, Bob replied. Neither do communities that refuse to welcome Sterling Industries projects. Neither does a workforce that sees the company as an adversary instead of a partner. He pulled out another document. Emma and I have been researching Sterling Industries' expansion plans for the next 5 years. Renewable energy projects in rural Texas, manufacturing facilities in small towns, technology centers in communities that have never seen that kind of investment. Every one of those projects will be easier and more profitable if Sterling Industries is seen as a community partner instead of a corporate invader, Emma added. The restitution fund establishes that reputation, Victoria smiled, watching the board members process the argument. Bob and Emma had grasped the essential truth about corporate power. It wasn't enough to be right. You had to frame being right in terms that profit-focused executives could understand. There's one more thing, Victoria said quietly. The fund isn't optional. As CEO and majority shareholder, I have the authority to implement it with or without board approval. Hartman's face reddened. Victoria, if you're threatening, I'm not threatening anything. I'm explaining reality. Victoria's voice was calm but implacable. The question isn't whether the fund will be created. The question is whether Sterling Industries will embrace this new direction willingly, or whether I'll need to replace board members who can't adapt to our changing priorities. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to consider the implications. Victoria Sterling controlled 51% of Sterling Industries stock. She could, if necessary, reshape the entire board. What exactly are you proposing? Volkov asked finally. Victoria gestured to Bob and Emma. The Mitchell family becomes part of Sterling Industries' leadership team. Bob oversees community development and ensures that our expansion projects benefit local families. Emma joins our technology development division, working on sustainable innovation while she completes her education. You want to hire a 16-year-old? Richardson sounded incredulous. I want to hire a brilliant engineer who understands how corporate decisions affect real people, Victoria corrected. Someone who can help us build technology that serves communities instead of displacing them. Emma spoke up. My first project would be developing early warning systems for communities in tornado zones, improving emergency communications, creating distributed shelter networks, using satellite technology to provide advance warning even in areas with limited infrastructure, Bob added, and making sure that Sterling Industries' disaster response capabilities are available to any community where we operate. Not as charity, but as part of our commitment to being good neighbors. Victoria looked around the table, reading the board members' faces. Hartman still looked skeptical, but Volkov and Richardson were clearly intrigued. The others were waiting to see which way the political winds would blow. "The fund launches next month," Victoria announced. "The Mitchell family will be our first beneficiaries and our partners in designing delivery systems for all the others. Board members who want to be part of this initiative are welcome. Those who don't can submit their resignations whenever convenient." She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Bob, Emma, let's talk about implementation details. We have work to do." As they left the boardroom, Bob felt the same sense of unreality that had been haunting him for 3 days. Monday morning, he'd been a struggling garage owner facing financial ruin. Thursday afternoon, he was walking out of a corporate boardroom as a partner in a $750 million initiative. "Think they'll fight us?" he asked Victoria quietly. "Some will," she replied, "but they'll lose. Money talks in rooms like this, and I have more money than they do." Emma looked up from her laptop, where she was already sketching out plans for tornado warning systems. "Plus, they know we're right, even if they don't want to admit it," Victoria smiled, watching the teenager who had impressed a room full of executives with her combination of brilliance and moral clarity. "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you were planning to give up MIT to protect your father from more financial stress, how did that feel?" Emma considered the question seriously. Terrifying, but also kind of inevitable. When you love someone, you do whatever it takes to protect them. Victoria nodded slowly. "That's what I've been missing. The part about love. Corporate decisions always seem easier when you don't love the people they affect." Bob reached out and took Victoria's hand, a gesture that would have seemed impossible a week ago. "So we build something different. Something that remembers love." As they walked through Sterling Industries' gleaming headquarters, planning a future that none of them could have imagined a week earlier, Bob thought about the tornado that had brought them together. Destruction followed by unexpected grace, loss transformed into possibility. Sometimes the storm really was just the beginning of the story. The wedding was supposed to be simple, just family and close friends, in the backyard of the house Bob and Victoria had built together on the outskirts of Millfield. But simple was a relative term when one of the participants was Victoria Sterling, and the guest list had grown to include governors, senators, several Nobel Prize winners, and what seemed like half the population of Texas. "Dad, you look nervous," Emma said, adjusting Bob's tie for the third time. At 19, she'd grown into the brilliant young woman everyone had predicted she'd become, splitting her time between MIT's doctoral program and Sterling Industries' Innovation Lab. Her latest project, a network of community resilience centers that combined tornado shelters with technology hubs, was being implemented across the Midwest. "I'm not nervous," Bob lied, tugging at his collar. "I'm just overwhelmed." Through the window of the bedroom that had become his dressing room, he could see the chaos of preparation outside. Victoria's event planners had transformed their modest backyard into something that belonged in magazines, but they'd done it with sensitivity to the community setting. Local vendors provided the food, Millfield High School's choir would perform, and Mrs. Henderson from the old shelter was making the wedding cake. "She loves you," Emma said simply. "Everything else is just details." Bob looked at his daughter, poised, confident, radiant with the kind of happiness that came from knowing her future was limitless. 3 years ago, she'd been prepared to give up her dreams to protect him from financial stress. Now she was revolutionizing disaster preparedness technology and dating a young physicist who made her laugh until she snorted. "How did we get so lucky?" he asked. Emma smiled. "We almost died in a tornado. You rescued a billionaire. She turned out to be the person whose company had ruined our lives. You both got over your issues and fell in love. And now Sterling Industries is the most respected corporation in America for community development." She shrugged. "Pretty standard love story." "Really?" Bob laughed, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders. "When you put it like that..." A knock at the door interrupted them. Harrison Webb, now Victoria's chief of staff and one of Bob's closest friends, peeked in. "5 minutes, Bob. Victoria's ready when you are." Bob nodded, taking a deep breath. Outside, he could hear the string quartet beginning the processional music. In a few minutes, he would walk down an aisle lined with people whose lives had been changed by the Sterling Mitchell partnership. As the media had dubbed their collaboration, there was the Rodriguez family from the original tornado shelter, whose son was now attending Stanford on a Sterling Industries scholarship. The construction crew from Bob's old garage, who now operated one of the most successful green building companies in Texas. The board members who had initially opposed the restitution fund, several of whom had become genuine friends as they'd seen the program's success. And scattered throughout the crowd were representatives of the 237 families who had received assistance through the fund, not just money, but partnerships, opportunities, and ongoing support that had helped them rebuild their lives. "Dad," Emma said softly, "look." Through the window, Bob could see Victoria emerging from the house. She wore a simple white dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and approachable, much like Victoria herself had become over the past 3 years. Her hair was styled loosely, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that she'd picked herself that morning. But what took Bob's breath away wasn't her beauty, though she was undeniably radiant. It was her smile, genuine, unguarded, full of joy and anticipation. The corporate armor was completely gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to let herself be vulnerable, to trust, to love without reservation. "Time to go," Harrison said gently. Bob kissed Emma's forehead, then followed Harrison downstairs and out to the backyard. The guests rose as he appeared, but Bob barely noticed them. His attention was fixed on Victoria, walking toward him with that incredible smile. When she reached him, Victoria handed her bouquet to Emma and took Bob's hands. Her fingers were steady, but he could feel the slight tremor that meant she was as moved as he was. "Hi," she said quietly. Just for him. "Hi yourself." The ceremony was conducted by Judge Martinez from Millfield's courthouse, a woman who had known Bob since Emma was small and who had watched Victoria integrate into their community with growing respect and affection. "We're gathered here today," Judge Martinez began, "to celebrate something that started with disaster and grew into something beautiful. Bob and Victoria found each other in the aftermath of destruction, and they've spent the past 3 years proving that even the worst storms can lead to new beginnings." Bob listened to the familiar words, but his attention was focused on Victoria's face. 3 years ago, she'd been a woman in hiding, isolated by wealth and guilt. Now she was surrounded by genuine friends, engaged in work that gave her life meaning, planning a future built on love and partnership. "The vows," Judge Martinez prompted. Victoria went first, her voice clear and strong. "Bob, you saved my life in that tornado. But more than that, you saved me from the prison I'd built round myself. You taught me that wealth without purpose is just elaborate poverty, and that the most valuable thing I could ever possess was your trust." She squeezed his hands. "I promise to love you with the same courage you showed when you ran into that storm. I promise to build our future together with the same care you put into raising Emma. And I promise that whatever challenges we face, we'll face them as partners." Bob felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Victoria, when I pulled you from that wreckage, I thought I was just doing what anyone would do. But you showed me that saving someone's life is just the beginning. You have to help them live it, too." His voice grew stronger. "You gave me back my purpose, my profession, my faith in the future. But most importantly, you gave me a partner who shares my belief that the most important thing we can do is take care of each other." He smiled. "I promise to love you through whatever storms come our way. I promise to keep building something beautiful with you. And I promise that our home will always be a place where love wins. By the power vested in me by the state of Texas," Judge Martinez said, her voice warm with affection, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Bob, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was soft, sweet, and full of promise. Around them, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Emma was crying happy tears that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Harrison was grinning like a proud parent. Even some of the Sterling Industries board members were wiping their eyes. As they broke apart, Victoria laughed with pure joy. So what now, Mr. Mitchell? Bob looked around at their friends and family, at the community they'd built together, at the daughter who was beaming with pride and happiness. Now we dance, Mrs. Sterling Mitchell, and then we keep building something wonderful. The reception lasted until well after midnight, filled with stories and laughter, and dancing under string lights that turned the backyard into something magical. Bob danced with Emma, with Mrs. Henderson, with board members and construction workers and tornado survivors who had become extended family. But his favorite dance was the last one, when the crowd had thinned and the cleanup crew was working quietly around them. Victoria in his arms, moving slowly to music that existed only in their shared contentment. "No regrets?" she asked, echoing the question she'd posed on the night he'd proposed. Bob thought about the long journey that had brought them here from the storm that had nearly killed them both to this moment of perfect happiness. The path had been complicated, sometimes painful, often uncertain, but it had led to this love, partnership, purpose, and the promise of building something lasting together. "None," he said, spinning her slowly under the stars. "Not a single one." In the distance, the lights of Millfield twinkled like earthbound stars. The community they'd helped rebuild and strengthen was sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new connections, new possibilities for growth and hope. And in a backyard in Texas, two people who had found each other in the aftermath of disaster danced to the music of a future they would write together, one day at a time, one act of love at a time, one shared dream at a time. The storm had passed. The rebuilding was complete. Now came the best part of all, living happily ever after. The Sterling Mitchell Community Innovation Center in Millfield buzzed with activity as Emma put the finishing touches on her presentation. At 24, she was the youngest department head in Sterling Industries history, but no one questioned her qualifications anymore. Her tornado early warning network had saved hundreds of lives across the Midwest, and her sustainable technology initiatives were being adopted by communities worldwide. "Ready for the big announcement?" Bob asked, joining her at the podium. His hair was grayer now, and he wore the confident bearing of someone who had found his true calling. As Sterling Industries Vice President of Community Development, he had overseen the expansion of their model to 12 states and 47 communities. "Ready," Emma confirmed, then smiled. "Though I still can't believe Victoria managed to keep this secret for 6 months." Victoria approached from across the room, moving carefully. At 6 months pregnant, she glowed with happiness and the particular contentment that came from a life filled with love and purpose. Her transformation from isolated billionaire to community leader and devoted wife had been so complete that sometimes Bob forgot she had ever been anyone else. "Places, everyone," Victoria called to the gathered crowd. "Time for the big reveal." The audience included familiar faces, construction workers who had become green technology specialists, families who had rebuilt their lives through the Restitution Fund, students whose educational opportunities had been transformed by Sterling Industries partnerships, but it also included new faces, representatives from other corporations who wanted to learn from the Sterling Mitchell model, international observers studying their approach to sustainable development, and journalists documenting what had become known as the Millfield Miracle. Emma stepped to the microphone. "5 years ago, a tornado destroyed our town and brought my father and Victoria together. Today, we're announcing the next phase of that partnership, the Global Community Resilience Initiative." The presentation that followed outlined an ambitious plan to export their model worldwide partnerships between corporations and communities that prioritize human flourishing alongside economic growth. The initiative would be funded by a consortium of companies, led by Sterling Industries but including former competitors who had embraced the collaborative approach. "The goal," Victoria explained as she took over the presentation, "isn't just to rebuild after disasters, but to build communities that are so strong, so connected, so innovative that they can weather any storm." Bob concluded with words that had become his signature. We learned that the most important infrastructure isn't roads or buildings or technology, it's trust. It's the bonds between people who choose to take care of each other. After the presentation, as the crowd mingled and reporters asked questions, Bob found himself standing with Victoria and Emma on the center's observation deck, looking out over Millfield. The town was barely recognizable from the devastated community they'd encountered after the tornado. Solar panels glinted on rooftops, community gardens flourished in former vacant lots, and a new high school dedicated to science and technology attracted students from across the region. Second thoughts? Victoria asked, her hand resting on her growing belly. Bob considered the question seriously. Their lives had become larger, more complex, more public than he'd ever imagined. There were board meetings and international conferences, media interviews and political pressures. Sometimes he missed the simplicity of working with his hands in a small garage. But then he thought about the families they'd helped, the communities they'd strengthened, the innovations they'd fostered. He thought about Emma's excitement as she tackled increasingly ambitious projects, about Victoria's joy in work that fed her soul as well as her bank account. And he thought about the child on the way, the son or daughter who would grow up in a world where corporate power and community values weren't seen as opposing forces, where business success was measured not just in profits but in lives improved and futures brightened. No, he said, pulling both women close. No second thoughts, just gratitude. As the sun set over Millfield, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the three of them stood together planning their next adventure. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but the work of building something beautiful would continue for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible but unmistakably present, was the sound of a community at peace, children playing, neighbors talking, dreams taking root in the fertile ground of hope and love and second chances. The tornado had rewritten their destinies, but they had chosen to make that story one of triumph. 5 years later, as Bob Mitchell stood on the observation deck of the Sterling Mitchell Community Innovation Center, watching the sun set over a town that had risen from devastation, he understood something his father had tried to teach him long ago. Sometimes the worst storms bring the greatest gifts. The tornado had taken everything: his business, his home, his sense of security. But in the wreckage, he'd found something infinitely more valuable. Not just love, though Victoria had become the partner he never thought he'd have again. Not just prosperity, though their work had lifted hundreds of families from financial ruin. He'd found purpose. Victoria Sterling could have remained hidden behind her fortress walls, drowning in guilt and isolation. Instead, she chose to step into the storm, literally and figuratively, to face the consequences of her company's actions. She chose vulnerability over safety, connection over control. Emma would never have to sacrifice her dreams for her father's financial struggles. More than that, she was building a future where other brilliant young minds wouldn't have to choose between family loyalty and personal ambition. The restitution fund had helped 237 families rebuild their lives. But perhaps the most important transformation was the simplest: three broken people who learned that healing happens when you stop building walls and start building bridges. What storms in your own life might be hiding unexpected gifts?